The Whitmore Call. The snow had been falling since noon. Dr. Edmund Fallow noticed it first as a polite dusting on the bonnet of his Volvo, the kind of snow that didn't yet commit to anything, that left the roads merely damp and the fields merely pale. By the time he'd finished his last appointment at the surgery in Harwick, signed off on 3 repeat prescriptions, and argued gently with Mrs. Pettingraw about her blood pressure medication for the 4th time this month, the sky had lowered itself, like a lid being pressed down over the world, and the snow had made up its mind. He sat in the car park for a moment before starting the engine. The surgery was the last building on the eastern edge of Harwick, and from the driver's seat he could see the village tapering away behind him in the dark, the amber glow of the Crown and Thistle, the blue flicker of televisions in curtained windows, the orange cone of a street lamp catching the falling snow and turning it into something almost beautiful. Ahead of him, through the windscreen, there was only a B-road and the dark, and the snow coming down in long, unhurried lines. He checked the address again on the printout he'd folded into his pocket: Whitmore, G, and E14 Fell Lane, Dunmore Hollow. Below that, a note in the handwriting of Janet, the surgery's receptionist. No mobile signal past the junction, landline only. 01432, and then the smear of ink where she dragged her sleeves across the wet page. He had the first 4 digits. Not ideal. He had called twice that afternoon, both times a brief engagement tone and then silence. Not the flat silence of a disconnected line, but a strange, almost listening silence, as though the phone had been picked up and then held against someone's chest. He concluded, reasonably enough, that the line was poor. Old couples in remote farmhouses often had poor lines. George Whitmore was 81 and had, according to the notes forwarded from his previous GP in Shrewsbury, a heart condition that merited monitoring. His wife, Edna, was 78, and her notes said very little beyond a history of mild arthritis and a remarkable resistance to ever seeing a doctor. Whoever had called the surgery on their behalf that morning, the notes only said, family member, concerns, both patients, had not left a number. Edmund had considered, for perhaps 30 seconds, leaving it until morning. Then he had thought about George Whitmore's heart and the snow that was falling, and the way that old people in remote houses sometimes simply ceased to be found until they were very late to doing so. He had started the engine. That was 20 minutes ago. He was already beyond the last of Harwick's ambient glow, and the road had narrowed into a B-road into something that felt provisional, a strip of tarmac that the surrounding fields had agreed, for the moment, to tolerate. The hedgerows rose on either side, dense and black, clogged at their bases with already drifting snow. His headlights illuminated perhaps 15 metres ahead of him, and then gave up. Beyond that, the dark was total. He drove at 30. There was no reason to go faster. The sat-nav had lost the address twice, and he had switched it off. He was working from a hand-drawn map that Janet had produced from somewhere, and from the vague geographical knowledge of a man who had lived in this part of Shropshire for 11 years, and knew its roads in a way that you know the face of someone you pass regularly without ever quite speaking to. The radio was on, Radio 4, a discussion programme about something parliamentary. He wasn't listening. He was watching the snow and the road and thinking about nothing in particular when he first heard it. It came from somewhere outside and to his left, a sound that initially took for the wind picking up against the car's bodywork, a low, oscillating moan, wavering in pitch, that rose and then fell, and then seemed to bend sideways in a way that wind didn't quite manage. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then it stopped. Edmund turned down the radio. He drove another 100 metres in silence. The sound didn't repeat. Wind, he thought. Old hedgerows catch the wind in all sorts of ways. He turned the radio back up. Fell Lane was marked by a wooden sign so weathered that the letters had nearly surrendered back into the grain of the wood. He almost missed it, catching it at the last moment in his peripheral vision, and had to reverse 6 feet on an empty road to make the turn. The lane was single track, bounded on both sides by dry stone walls that emerged from the snow like the spines of buried animals. The surface was worse here, the tarmac old and cracked, the cracks now filled with ice, and Edmund reduced his speed to 20, then to 15. The windscreen wipers swept back and forth in a patient arc. Snow accumulated on the glass in the corners where the wipers didn't reach, building small white hedges that grew incrementally with each pass. It was perhaps 5 minutes up the lane, 2 miles he estimated, of the 6 marked on Janet's map, when he hit something, or thought he did. There was no impact. That was the first thing that didn't cohere. There was no thud, no crunch, no jolt transmitted up through the chassis, but he saw it clearly, a figure, directly in the beam of his headlights, standing in the centre of the lane not 10 metres ahead, tall, dark-coated, facing him. Edmund's foot hit the brake before his brain had finished processing the image, and the car slid 2 feet on the ice before stopping. He sat, breathing, staring at the road ahead. The lane was empty. Nothing, just the snow falling through the headlights and the 2 dry stone walls and darkness beyond. He sat for perhaps 15 seconds, with his hands still locked on the wheel and his eyes tracking systematically across everything his headlights could reach. The lane, the walls, the field beyond the wall to the right where the ground rose away from the black moorland sky. Nothing moved except for snow. Fatigue, Edmund told himself. Pareidolia. You see shapes in bad light and bad weather. He was a doctor. He had a reasonable working knowledge of the ways in which the human mind generated false positives. He also had, despite himself, an absolute reluctance to remain in the car. He put it in park, left the engine running, the headlights on. He pulled his coat tighter, a heavy wool overcoat, adequate in town, suddenly exposed out here, and opened the door. The cold hit him immediately, a physical force rather than a temperature. The wind had picked up and drove the snow sideways, and the world outside the car was shades of dark grey and pale white and absolutely nothing else. He walked to the front of the car and stood in the headlight beam, looking at the road surface. No marks in the snow, no disturbance. Whatever he had seen, or thought he had seen, had left no evidence of itself. He turned to look behind the car, checking the lane in both directions. Nothing. The lane ran back the way he had come, and vanished almost immediately into the dark and falling snow, and ahead of him it curved slightly left and also vanished. He became aware that he was listening very hard for something. The wind moved through the dry stone walls with a sound like distant breathing. Snow hissed softly against his coat. The engine ticked. And then, from somewhere out in the field to his left, close enough that he sharply turned towards it, close enough that his body registered it before his mind did, close enough that it took a single involuntary step backwards towards the car, the sound came again. It was not the wind. He understood that now, with a certainty that his rational mind immediately began trying to dismantle. It was a human sound in the way that it had texture and intention, but it was not human in any other sense. It rose from a low moan into something that climbed and then did not stop climbing. A wail that passed through frequencies that felt less heard than felt. A vibration in the back teeth. A pressure behind the eyes. It lasted 4 or 5 seconds. Then it dropped abruptly to nothing, and the silence it left behind had a different quality than the silence before it. A silence that felt scraped clean of something that had always previously been there. Edmund got back in the car. He locked the doors. He sat for a moment looking at his own hands on the wheel, which were entirely steady. He was a man who had spent 15 years in emergency medicine before going into general practice. A man who had declared time of death in corridors and delivered news that broke people's faces open like paper. He did not panic. He noted the physiological signs, elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, a faint ringing in his left ear that would pass, and he put the car into drive and he continued up the lane. The snow was coming harder now. He could see it in the quality of the headlight beams, which was taken on this dense, busy texture, the flakes large and close together, filling the air with pale motion. The lane had narrowed further, and the dry stone walls gave away to open fence posts, and then to nothing, and the fields around him became a formless grey-white dark that could have extended for miles, or could have risen sharply 6 feet beyond the range of his lights, and he would have no way of knowing. The map said, past the second cattle grid, fell lane turn sharp right, keep going approximately 1 mile. He had counted 1 cattle grid, felt it rattle through the car's suspension with that particular metallic percussion. He was waiting for the second. He had, very carefully, not turned the radio on. The parliamentary discussion had given way to a late evening arts programme. A woman with a soft voice was talking about the poetry of someone Edmund didn't recognise. The sound of her voice was, he had decided, essential. It meant that the world, the ordinary world, the one with radio stage studios and programme schedules and women with soft voices who knew things about poetry, was still present. It was accessible. It was only a matter of getting to the other side of this weather and this dark. It was perhaps 3 minutes past where he had stopped the car when he saw it again. This time it was to the right, a shape behind the fence line, caught at the very edge of his headlights' reach, standing absolutely still in the field. He registered it in his peripheral vision first and turned to look directly, and it resolved into, what, a fence post? The distance was wrong for a fence post. It was taller than a fence post, more vertical, and it was not the grey-white of snow-covered timber, but a dark that seemed to absorb the available light rather than reflect it. He slowed to 10 miles an hour, watching it. It did not move. He drove past it, and it slid out of view behind him, and he increased his speed again and looked in the rearview mirror and saw only snow and dark. A post, he said aloud, just to hear a voice. His own voice sounded strange in the enclosed space of a car, too flat, too careful. An old fence post. The snow gives everything odd proportions. He hit the second cattle grid. The car shuddered across it. He turned sharp right. The lane was even worse. It was barely a lane at all. It was a track, 2 compressed lines to use the grass, and it had churned to mud in autumn and now frozen in the state of being covered with snow, so that the surface was an archipelago of frozen ruts that caught the car's front wheels and tried to drag it sideways every 20 metres. Edmund drove with both hands firm on the wheel, correcting constantly, keeping his speed low. The arts programme woman was talking about suffering in poetry. He turned the radio off. He needed to concentrate. He had been driving in silence for perhaps 4 minutes. He estimated another half mile, maybe less, when he would become aware of the sound again, but differently this time. Before it had come from outside, now it was alongside, pacing him, as though something moved in the field to his left at exactly the speed of the car, close to the fence line, just beyond the reach of his headlights, and was making a sound as it moved, a low rhythmic ululation that rose and fell with almost deliberate pacing, a sound that seemed to know he was listening and was calibrated for him, specifically, tuned to some frequency that his nervous system could not dismiss or rationalize or file away under acceptable explanations. It lasted the entire length of that half mile. It stopped only when he saw the shape in the road again. This time, he almost didn't stop. He thought, seriously, in the half second between seeing it and reaching the brake, don't stop, whatever this is, stopping doesn't help, keep driving. He stopped anyway. It was reflex. It was the thing a doctor did, the deep, trained instinct that said, there is a person in the road. You should not drive through it, not without stopping first and being certain. The figure stood perhaps 8 meters ahead, in the exact center of the track. It was facing him, as it had been there before. Its proportions were approximately right. It had the general arrangement of a person, upright, 2 legs, a head at the correct height, but the coat, if it was a coat, did not move in the wind the way fabric moved, and the figure did not raise a hand against the headlights, did not squint to turn its face, only stood and took the full light on without any response at all. Edmund left the engine running, left the headlights on, opened the doors. The cold was worse than before, dramatically worse, a plunging cold that went past discomfort into something physical, a cold that felt targeted. He walked around the driver's door and stood at the edge of the headlight beam. "Hello," he said. His voice came out fine, professional, the voice he used when he needed to be steady for someone else's sake. The figure did not move. He took 3 steps towards it, 5. He was 6 meters from it now, and his eyes were doing something strange. The harder he focused on the figure, the more it seemed to occupy the edge of his visual field rather than the center, as though it existed most vividly in the part of his vision not directly aimed at it. "Are you injured? Do you need—" the sound began. This time there was no gradual onset. It arrived at full volume, from directly ahead of him, from the figure, from the space the figure occupied, from the specific coordinates in the world where a person might be standing, and it was not a wail now, but something lower and more complex, a sound with harmonics in it, multiple tones producing an interference pattern that pressed against Edmund's eardrums with both sides simultaneously and made his vision swim. It was the sound, he thought wildly, of an old house settling in the high wind, but transposed into something biological, something with intention and pleasure in it. He stumbled backwards. The figure was gone. The sound continued for 5 seconds after the figure's absence, diminishing not in volume, but in focus, as though it was widening to fill the space, becoming less directional, until it was all around him, and then, between 1 second and the next, it was not there at all. Edmund stood in the track in the snow and breathed. There was pain behind his left eye that had not been there before. His ears rang. He was aware, without wanting to examine it closely, that the quality of his fear had changed. It was no longer the clean, useful alertness of a man responding to a threat he didn't yet understand. It had become something older, less organized, something that operated below his medical vocabulary, below his 11 years of professional composure. He got back in the car. He sat for a moment with his eyes closed, hands on his lap. He thought about Whitmore, George Whitmore's heart, the unknown family member who had called the surgery with concerns. He thought about what it would mean to turn around, the state of the lane, the nearness of the house, and the fact that he had come this far. He thought about it for a second. He put the car in drive. The last quarter mile was the worst of the driving. The track had largely ceased to be a track in any meaningful sense, and had become instead a vague intention, a general suggestion of direction that the snow was working methodically to obscure. He drove at walking pace, and even so the front wheels lost purchase twice, and he had to rock the car gently forward, and the rear end slid on the ice with a dreamy, uncontrolled weightlessness that required absolute calm to manage. The sound came 3 more times in that quarter mile. The first time it was behind the car, a brief stabbing shriek, high and sudden, that made Edmund clench the wheel and swear aloud. It was over before he could process it, gone in under 2 seconds, leaving nothing but a residual vibration in the window glass. The second time it was ahead of him, and it accompanied for the first time by the sense of movement, something crossing the track, from right to left, and in the dark just beyond his headlights' reach. He could not have said what he had saw. He was not sure of anything, but his body registered it in a way the body registers certain things in bad light, a displacement, a disruption in the uniformity of the dark, something that had been in one place and was now in another. The third time, it came from everywhere at once. It rose without warning from all 4 sides of the car simultaneously, pressing in through the glass and the steel, finding harmonics in the frame of the vehicle itself. Edmund felt the seatbelt vibrate against his chest, the steering wheel hum under his palms, and it climbed, and in climbing it became something that was no longer simply unpleasant, but actively wrong. Wrong in the way that smell could be wrong. Wrong in the way a sentence could contain words that were individually fine, but together communicated something that the brain refused. Edmund drove through it with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the 15 meters of visibility ahead of him, and then, between 1 second and the next, it stopped. The lane ended. There was a low gate, unlatched, and swung open at a permanent angle as though it hadn't been closed in years. Beyond the gate, a gravel yard, or what had been a gravel yard, and the gravel was now only occasionally a texture beneath the snow. And beyond the yard, the house. Edmund sat and looked at it through the windscreen. It was a farmhouse, stone-built, 2 stories, a low slate roof from which the snow hung in a smooth and unbroken overhang. It was dark. Every window was dark. Not the darkness of a house where occupants were in one room while the rest was unlit, but the uniform, toneless dark of an emptiness, of glass long since uncleaned, of curtains drawn or absent, of interior spaces no longer organized around any human activity. He sat for a long time. Then he got out of his car. He crossed the yard. His feet found loose slates under the snow, and rusted rasp that might once have secured a coal bin. He reached for the front door, a solid wooden door, painted once in a dark green, the paint now blistered and peeling away in long curls, and knocked. He knew before he knocked. The sound his knuckles had made against the wood was different from the sound of knocking on a door to a house where everyone lived. There was nothing behind it, no possibility of footsteps. He tried the handle. The door opened. The smell reached him before anything else, cold and damp, and old timber, and beneath that, the peculiar sweetness of prolonged vacancy, the smell of a house that had been eating itself slowly for years. He stepped into the hall, and the darkness was absolute, and he pulled out his phone and turned on the torch. The wallpaper had come away from the walls in a great vertical strip, and lay in desiccated scrolls on the skirting board. The floor was stone flags, filmed in a grey residue of damp. A coat stand had fallen. The coats that had hung on it, heavy, old-fashioned coats, a man's and a woman's, lay on the floor in a mute, deflated heap, the fabric stiff and faded. He moved through the house methodically. He was a doctor. He checked what needed checking. The kitchen, arranged with a thick coat of rust on its iron surfaces, a calendar on the wall. He angled the phone towards it. The year printed across the top was 15 years ago, and the month was November, and someone had put a cross through the first 9 days in ballpoint pen and then stopped. The sitting room, 2 armchairs positioned to face a fireplace, an end table with a cup on it, the residue inside long since dried in the dark ring. A framed photograph above the mantel, a couple, perhaps in their 60s, standing in the yard outside on a bright summer day. The woman was laughing at something off camera. The man was looking directly at the lens with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who has been asked to stand still. Edmund stood and looked at the photograph for some time. George Whitmore, Edna Whitmore. He didn't know that. He couldn't know that, but the house was 14 Fell Lane, Dunmore Hollow, and the house had been empty for 15 years, and there had been a call that morning to the surgery and a family member who had not left a number. He went back through the hall and out the front door and crossed the yard to his car. He could see it from 20 feet away. The figure was standing beside the driver's door. It was not attempting to be elsewhere or to conceal itself or to operate at the periphery of his vision. It was simply there, in the headlight wash, beside his car, in a way that something might stand beside a car while waiting for the owner to return. Its dark coat, or its dark surface, or its dark form, or the dark thing that approximated the shape and arrangement of clothing in a person, was still. The snow fell around it and onto it and continued falling rather than accumulating, as though it had no temperature, no physical surface for the snow to settle on. Edmund stopped walking. He stood in the yard with the snow coming down and looked at the thing beside his car. It turned its head towards him. He had not, until this moment, been certain it had a head. The geometry of the upper portion was a human approximate, but resisted direct examination, and when it moved, the small, precise movement of a head turning to regard something, Edmund felt his mind slide sideways, away from the recognition of it, the way an eye slides away from the word it cannot pass. Then it made the sound. Not a wail this time, not a rising shriek or a resonant harmonic pressure, something much quieter, almost conversational, a low, sustained note that changed in pitch by intervals too small to be music, but too deliberate to be anything else. A sound that seemed to be working towards something, moving through iterations of itself, searching for a register that would do what it needed to do. Edmund stood in the snow and let it search. He was thinking about the calendar, November, 15 years ago, the crosses through 9 days. He was thinking about the sound of the telephone that afternoon, picked up and then held, as though someone had carried it to the ear but had no breath to speak with. He was thinking about Janet's note, the ink smeared across the last digits of the number. He was thinking about what if it was someone who had been in that house, in the dark, for 15 years, might have needed a doctor for. The sound found its register. Edmund Fallow stood in the yard of an abandoned house on the fell of Shropshire, in the snow, at 9:20 on a Thursday evening, and he heard what he was trying to tell him. He did not move. The snow fell. The figure waited by his car, and the cold, which had been merely extraordinary, became something else entirely, became a cold with intention and duration, a cold that had been there long before him and knew, with the patience of whatever it was, that it would be here for long after.